At the end of the 14th century, Eastern Europe was at the crossroads of rising empires and falling glories. In the north, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had grown into one of the largest territorial entities in Europe, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the banks of the Dniester River. They were not only the rulers of the Lithuanians, but also the protectors of millions of Ruthenians, Slavic-speaking Orthodox peoples who had once lived in the shadow of the once prosperous Kiev. Lithuania was then a patchwork of culture, religion, and politics, both imbued with the breath of the West and steeped in the blood of the Eastern Slavs. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was then a monarchy that was half traditional, half reformed. While maintaining the Gaminas tradition of hereditary Grand Duchy, Lithuania also allowed some degree of autonomy to the Ruthenian lands, especially in Volhynia and Podolia. The local boy nobility, largely Orthodox, served as intermediaries between the center and the Slavic population, but they often demanded their own rights, creating a complex political environment where ethnic, religious, and power identities clashed. Meanwhile, the Baltic Lithuanian aristocracy, largely unconverted to Catholicism, sought a stable place in a European order that was increasingly merging religion and royalty. Vytautas, the head of the Grand Duchy, was not only a shrewd military strategist, but also a pragmatic politician. He had to balance the multi-religious noble blocs at home, reassure Catholic allies in the West, and try not to lose control of the increasingly unstable Ruthenia territories to the rising Russian powers. The geopolitical situation in the region was extremely complicated. Poland, after the Union of Crewe in 1385, was gradually tightening its ties with Lithuania through royal marriage, and conversion opening up a promising but internally conflicted Polish-Lithuanian union. This was a strange alliance. On one side was a Catholic kingdom with a Western feudal system. On the other was a multi-ethnic Semitic-converted Grand Duchy with a strong Eastern European model of governance where power was concentrated in the individual lord rather than in the law that made the Polish-Lithuanian Union both an opportunity for expansion and a political challenge for both sides. In the West, the Teutonic Knights remained a powerful force along the Baltic, both as potential military allies and ideological rivals to the Orthodox nobility in the Lithuanian-Ruthenian alliance. In the name of spreading the faith, the Teutonic Knights did not abandon their attempts to conquer Lithuanian lands. Despite the appearance of Dant, their presence was a constant reminder that if Vytautas failed to unite the country, they could turn and wage war from the north. In the east, the Grand Duchy of Moscow was emerging as a new Russian center, gradually emerging from the shadow of the Golden Horde, but still stifled by tribute and military intimidation. Moscow was projecting an image as the successor to Kiev, seeking to unite the surrounding Russia's principalities under an independent Orthodox banner. However, their real power was limited, especially by threats from the south and the Lithuanian presence in the northwest. Moscow was constantly caught in a dilemma: either resist the Golden Horde and risk retaliation, or feign neutrality and be its time. Meanwhile, the smaller Russia's principalities such as Tver, Ryazan, and Smolensk were hesitant between submitting to Moscow, following Lithuania, or maintaining beneficial neutrality with the Golden Horde. These principalities operated as local minor powers, reflecting the deep fragmentation of the medieval East Slavic space, where temporary alliances, sudden changes of allegiance, and sudden wars were the norm. Further to the southeast, the situation in Central Asia and Anatolia also had indirect effects. After defeating Tokamesh, Tamerlane the Great, emperor of the Timurids, began to turn his attention to Persia and the Caucasus. The wars between the Timurids and the Turco-Mongol dynasties in the region had displaced nomadic tribes, creating a wave of unrest that spread across the Golden Horde frontier, indirectly adding military pressure to the Volga region and the northern Black Sea plains. South of the Black Sea, the Ottoman Empire, although not directly intervening in the Rus or Golden Horde lands, had begun to emerge as a new power in the east-west balance. Ottoman merchants and spies were present in Kaffa, Azov, Sarai, bringing news, goods, and the seeds of links with the slave trade and the Muslim courts of Central Asia. To the south, a giant rival was sinking into crisis. The Golden Horde, the descendant of the Mongol Empire that had shaken Europe, was spiraling into disunity, civil war, and rebellion. The political system here was a fluid structure in which the Khan held symbolic power, while actual power was often in the hands of the generals, Noyan, or the vizier, Beglerbeg. From the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde went through more than a dozen Khans, most of whom died young, were assassinated, or were deposed. Outlying territories such as Crimea, Astrakhan, and the Volga were no longer under effective control, leaving the empire in a state of polyandric disorderly. Once feared from Moscow to Baghdad, the Golden Horde was now divided by its own Mongol generals, who fought over the throne with blood and treachery. In the gray smoke of civil war, one name stands out: Tokhamish, a Khan who briefly reunited the Golden Horde, only to be ousted by his old enemy, Tamerlane, the Lord of Samarkand. The defeat was not only a personal blow, but also a sign that the Golden Horde was no longer a monolithic empire, but an arena of rival Mongol factions. Deposed and exiled, Tokhamish wandered from nomadic camp to territory, eventually finding refuge under the arms of Grand Duke Vadas of Lithuania. But the refuge was not simply a matter of friendship. Vadas, ambitious and shrewd, realized that if he could restore Tokhamish to the throne of the Horde, he would not only gain a powerful ally in the south, but also open the door to the Black Sea, the center of trade, commerce, and strategic influence in the region. For Vytautas, the Black Sea was the key to escaping the geopolitical encirclement, a non-Teutonic sea route, not dependent on Poland, and far enough away to exert its own influence. For him, this war was not just about restoring a friend, but about transforming Lithuania from a Baltic power into a geopolitical challenger in both Eastern and Southern Europe. So in 1399, as Europe recovered from the Black Death and prepared for the age of religious wars, Vadas assembled an unprecedented military alliance. Lithuanians, Poles, Ruthenians, Moravians, Teutonic Knights, and Tokhamis's army, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-ambitious army. They had in mind the prospect of a glorious victory, defeating the Mongol raiders, opening the way to the Black Sea, and restoring Tokhamish to the throne as a political pawn under Lithuania. But history never works according to the script of those sitting in tents. On the other side, Tamar Kotlak, a young but ruthless Khan, and Eddie Gu, a brilliant nomadic strategist, had united a large part of the Golden Horde and decided to prevent Tokhamish's counterattack from happening. To them, Vytautas' attack was not simply a war, but an affront to the very existence of the Golden Horde, an empire that had once cast its thunder across Eurasia. As the spring of 1399 wore on, clouds of horse dust began to rise from the forests north of the Dnieper. It was no simple army. It was a coalition as vast and colorful as the map of Eastern Europe itself, under the command of Grand Duke Vytautas. An army of 30,000 to 50,000 men had been mobilized. It was one of the most complex and multi-ethnic armies ever assembled in pre-modern history. It included battle-hardened Lithuanian cavalry, Polish knights in European armor, Orthodox-speaking East Slavic-speaking Ruthenians, Moravian mercenaries accustomed to mountain warfare, and a small Teutonic force representing a Catholic Europe that watched Vadas' every move. He was even joined by Tokhamish, the exiled Khan, with a loyal army who hoped to restore his country by someone else's hand. Vytautas' position at this time was not only based on his strength, but also on the political prestige he was building. The alliance with Poland through King Joga had given him Western support. The popes in Avignon were also watching developments to weigh the influence of Lithuania in the struggle for influence with the Eastern Orthodox and Muslim horde. The return of Tokamesh to the throne was not only a military goal, but also a major diplomatic card with the hope of establishing a new order in the Black Sea region, where Venice, Genoa, and even the Byzantine Empire were competing for influence every day. Preparations were not only about the number or type of soldiers. Vitalis understood that he could not afford to let his army get bogged down in a long campaign on the Mongolian steppe. So the strategy was to strike fast and win fast, head south along the Vorskla River, breach Temir Kutluk's defenses, crown Tokamesh, and return before winter began to devour the Ukrainian plain. To do this, Vitalis prepared his logistics carefully. Supply stations along the way, wagons carrying provisions, military engineers carrying primitive cannons, weapons he hoped would break through the enemy's strongholds in a short time. Crude maps, marching directions, and neutral Ruthenian intelligence were also used to maintain speed. But he misjudged one thing. The Golden Horde was not defended by walls, but by space. On the other side of the battle line, Temur Kutlug and Edigu were not panicked by the massive force. They had no artillery, no steel armor, no European cavalry, but they had something Vitotis could not buy: nomadic experience, the toughness of steppe warfare, and a do-or-die spirit that was bound to the call of the great desert. Temir Kotlu devised a plan that seemed strange to the Europeans: a feigned retreat. He moved the regular army slowly back to the southeast of the Vorskla River, fooling Vitalis into thinking the Golden Horde was retreating and disintegrating. At the same time, Edigu, like a ghost, led a large hidden army south around the right flank of the Allied army, preparing to strike the rear. It was a classic steppe tactic: lure the enemy out of his defensive position, draw him into the open, and then strike at the flanks and back where all European armies were weakest. In essence, the Golden Horde did not want to defend a city or a route, but to reenact the exact same scenario that had helped their ancestors conquer Eurasia, using mobility to counter immobility, using grasslands as trenches and replacing citadels with speed. With the combination of Temur Kutlu, the legitimate symbol, and Edigu, the sharp military mind, the Golden Horde was no longer a crumbling ruin, but a beast taking a step back to gain momentum. In the summer of 1399, as the scorching heat of the sun beat down on the steppes of today's Pava region, the Vadas Tokamesh army was approaching its goal. They had come from the north, crossed the Ruthenian lands, followed the Dnieper River, and turned southeast, where the Vorskla River quietly meandered between tall meadows and undulating banks. The Allied army marched in three directions. The Lithuanian-Polish wing went from Polotsk through Minsk down to the Kiev region. The Ruthenians and Moravians joined up at the confluence of the Dnieper River, while the Teutonic units moved around along the southwest axis. All gathered near Lubny, then crossed the Vorskla River from the right bank, occupying the heights on the river. At the same time, Temur Kutlug advanced from the middle Volga, following the Samara-Pava corridor. Edigu, meanwhile, split his main army into smaller groups, skirting the edge of the forest south of Vorskla, moving in cover overnight to attack the enemy's right flank. It was not friendly ground. The Vorskla River was shallow but muddy, its bank sloping and slippery, easily exhausting war horses. In August, the scorching summer sun left the ground parched by noon, but still held a layer of soft mud beneath. Hot winds from the Sea of Azov blew up clouds of dust, obscuring visibility and causing severe dehydration. To European commanders, it was an easy plain to attack, but to the nomads, it was an open maze, a place where an entire army could be hidden in the dust and glare of the setting sun. Vitalis, believing he was catching up with a disintegrating horde, camped on the right bank of the Vorskla, near a low, narrow area that was ideal for setting up a wooden cart defense. His army consisted of Lithuanian heavy cavalry, about 10,000 Polish knights, Ruthenian infantry, German and Moravian mercenaries, some, Teutonic units, and 7,000 cavalry loyal to Tokamaish, organized in the Western European style, concentrating artillery and supply wagons in the center and setting up camp in the form of a mobile fortress with wooden wagons. Wagenburg, the artillery, about 20 primitive cannons, were placed at fixed points with short ranges based on newly introduced Hazard technology. However, due to the hot and dry climate, gunpowder was affected by low humidity and difficult to operate. The flat terrain also left the artillery positions exposed, making them easy targets for mobile cavalry. Timur Kutlu, along with the regular Golden Horde, camped across the river. Not rushing to attack, he used delaying tactics, negotiations, stalling, feigning retreat, playing on Vitatis' complacency. Meanwhile, Adiju, a veteran strategist, secretly led 15,000 to 20,000 light cavalry, detouring southward, along dry and bushy paths, through the valleys between the tributaries of the Vorskla River, advancing behind the Allied formation. August 12, 1399, the battle begins. In the morning, the sky was clear. The southeast wind blew directly at Vitatis' formation. The early morning sun was strong. The dust was thick, blurring the vision and hindering the transmission of orders. Timur Kutlu ordered his troops to flee and retreat. Vitus, thinking that the enemy had disintegrated, immediately ordered the Lithuanian and Malavian vanguards to pursue him out of the camp fortress. At that time, his main formation was stretched. The artillery had not yet opened fire, and the rear was almost unprotected. From the south, Edigu launched the decisive blow. The nomadic cavalry poured out of the grass like a broken dam, directly hitting the rear line containing 80 supply wagons, 400 engineers, and a primitive gunpowder depot. The surprise attack caused chaos in the ranks. Pack horses panicked. Wagons overturned, gunners were trampled, and some cannons were burned or captured. The rear guard and camp were almost completely destroyed. At the same time, Timur Kutlu sent all his cavalry to attack the front, forming a coordinated pincer movement. The light cavalry fired arrows and retreated. The heavy cavalry charged into the middle. The Polish and Ruthenian infantry units had no time to change their formation due to the dust and the chaotic orders. The German units tried to form an inverted trapezoidal defensive line, but were sniped and driven around. With no woods to hide in, no hills to defend against, the entire formation was crushed in the open grassland. Fighting took place along the southern bank of the Vorskla River for more than 4 kilometers in a sea of dust, gunpowder, smoke, and horse carcasses. The forward commanders were killed one after another. Those units that were not destroyed retreated to the timber camp only to be surrounded and burned later. Tokish, despite his dreams of national restoration, was one of the first to retreat, taking a few hundred of his followers with him, leaving his loyal forces to die. He was never trusted again after that day. Vuidis, who led the charge, was nearly captured. He fell from his horse, was slightly wounded, and managed to break out of the encirclement with less than 500 of his loyal cavalry crossing the Vorskla River northwestward during the night, leaving behind his entire camp supplies, artillery, and officers. Within hours, the coalition was destroyed or disintegrated. At least 50 high-ranking nobles and hundreds of Lithuanian and Polish mid-level commanders were killed or captured. Some Russian and Polish sources say that corpses were spread from the riverbanks to the northern plains, stretching for miles. Almost all of Europe's artillery was captured or destroyed. Malavian, Ruthenian, and German mercenary units were completely wiped out on the battlefield. Scorched wheel tracks, shattered artillery shells, and charred horse saddles became evidence of one of the most tragic defeats in the military history of 14th century Eastern Europe. The Battle of Vorskla ended not only in a crushing military defeat, but also in a series of political shocks that spread throughout Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. In less than a day, one of the greatest military alliances of the 14th century was crushed. and Vitalis' dream of hegemony over the steppe was shattered. The Battle of Vorskla did not end in blood and dust. It ushered in a new order in Eastern Europe from which neither of the main combatants could return. Militarily, the coalition's losses were catastrophic. Estimates range from 25,000 to 30,000 soldiers killed or captured, including hundreds of nobles, commanders, and confidants of the great families of Lithuania, Poland, and Ruthenia. Nearly all of the artillery, supply wagons, medical camps, and war horses were destroyed or fell into the hands of the Golden Horde. About 80% of Vitus' forces did not return. The Moravian army and the German mercenaries were nearly wiped out. Notably, some historical sources record that Teutonic soldiers were killed in the battle, marking a rare occasion when the Knights Templar fought on the side of their traditional enemies. For Vitalis, the defeat was a terrible political blow. He lost thousands of elite soldiers, including many of his nobles, the pillars of his rule in Ruthenia and Pataleia. His ambitions to dominate the Black Sea were shattered, and Lithuania was forced to abandon its plans to expand southwards. Territories that had been conquered from the Golden Horde near the Black Sea, such as Belgorod, Kajibi, and the Crimean coast, were left in the dust. To salvage the situation, Vitalis was forced to return to the political chessboard and become closer to Poland, leading to the Vilnius-Radom Union in 1401, a key step in moving Poland and Lithuania towards a permanent federation. The Battle of Vorskla, in this sense, forced Vitalis to abandon his dream of Ruthenia emperor and become an ally of Kiev, accepting to play by the rules of the Western monarchs. Relations with King Jola of Poland became strained as many Polish nobles blamed Vitalis for dragging them into a haughty and feudal war. The prospect of a unified Poland-Lithuania was put on hold. For many years after that, Vitus did not organize any further campaigns deep into the steppe, a major change from his previous mindset of constant expansion. As for Tokamesh, the pawn placed on the board by Vitus, he was permanently eliminated from the game. After Vorskla, he became a landless exile, wandering the Caucasus Mountains until his death. The last dream of a post-Mongol Khan's restoration was over, like the last shadow of the great Khan's era. For the Golden Horde, the victory at Vorskla was a major turning point. It allowed Taimur Kutlug and Edigu to consolidate absolute power in the heart of the lower Volga. Although Timur, Kutlug died only a year after the battle. Edigu, as Beglerbeg, vice-chancellor, became the real power, establishing a military dynasty that lasted for decades. This victory saved the Golden Horde from disintegration and allowed it to exert influence over the Russian principalities for at least another generation. The principalities of Moscow, T, and Ryazan, which had been observing the war with caution, were now forced to continue paying tribute and submitting to the enemy. On the other hand, the victors, Edigu and Taimur Kutlu, rose to new heights. Timur became Khan, and Edigu, though not in the name of king, became the de facto regent of the Golden Horde, establishing a new system, a two-headed state with military power in the hands of nomadic generals and the kingship in name only. Edigu went on to lead the horde in several campaigns against Moscow and the East Slavic states, ensuring a brief period of stability. Geopolitically, the Battle of Vorskla redraws the map of Eastern European influence. Lithuania, after this defeat, gradually becomes more defensive, shifting its focus to the southwest to compete for influence in the Galicia-Volhynia region with Poland, instead of pushing deep into the steppe. Poland, after this shock, also changes its strategy. It turns to Central Europe and disputes Silesia with Hungary, abandoning the idea of opening the Black Sea via the Tish. In the long term, the Battle of Vorskla puts an end to Lithuania's decisive role in southern Eastern Europe, paving the way for the return of Moscow, the Russian states, and most importantly, Poland as a leading force in the Catholic League. It was also from this defeat that Vitalis was forced to turn his career west, where he later contributed to the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, defeating the Teutonic Knights. A victory that redeemed Vorskla. One of the most lasting effects of this defeat was the complete end of any hope of restoration for the foreign-backed exiled Khans. Both Lithuania and Poland, and later Moscow, understood that the Mongols, however divided, were still a formidable force on the steppe, not easily replaced by puppet Khans backed by Western courts. This lesson would later be applied in reverse by Moscow in the 15th century when it gradually defeated the Golden Horde with the same patient and persistent approach. Finally, it is worth mentioning the silence of Europe in the face of this defeat. No crusade was organized to rescue Vitatus. No envoys from Rome spoke up. The Battle of Vorskla, in a way, showed the limits of Western interest in the war in Eastern Europe, and also showed that in this land, all great wars are fought in isolation. Vorskla was not just a failed battle, but a milestone that signaled the end of the period of Western intervention in the politics of the Golden Horde. From here, the two worlds, East Slav, Russia, the Mongol Khanate would enter a period of deep division lasting until the 16th century. And like a historical paradox, the Vorskla, thought to be just a quiet branch of the steppe, turned into a fateful boundary between what Lithuania once aspired to and the reality that they were forced to admit. Vorskla did not bestow glory on anyone. Vitalis lost his dream of hegemony. Tokhamish lost his last chance to restore his country. And Eddie Gu, despite his victory, only preserved an empire that was decaying from within. But that is why Vorskla deserves to be remembered more than ever, not as an epic, but as a mirror that reveals the limits of ambition, of power, and of history. Because perhaps the most haunting battles are not those where the ramparts collapsed, but those where not a single brick remained. Only the wind swept through the burnt grass, and corpses lay in the middle of the plain. And if this story has opened up a new perspective for you about Eastern Europe, about strategy, or about people, then please leave a trace, a like, a subscription, or a comment about the battle you want us to excavate next. Because sometimes history only needs one person to remember to keep it alive.